Are we good?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Hi, everybody. Hello, live stream internet people. This is the OASIS Lunchtime Talks. Today we have a really cool speaker all the way from MIT Game Lab, most recently in the United States. This is Mikael Jakobsson. He's the research coordinator at MIT Game Lab. He's a designer with a really long history. He's a researcher and a pedagogue on game studies, game cultures, and design techniques. Today he's going to be presenting about his research about the colonial history of games, dealing with kind of these rhetorics of exploitation and I'm sure all sorts of other things embedded inside of game mechanics that we maybe don't immediately see, but we've taken for granted in some ways. So, Mikael Jakobsson, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Leland. Thank you, Frans, for inviting me to come here today. Before I start the presentation, I want to give a couple of shout outs. So I'm going to talk today about a project that I've done together with my colleague at the MIT Game Lab, Richard Eberhardt. And it builds on the book Playing Oppression that I wrote together with Mary Flanagan. And I also want to thank all the research assistants, students, and just people in general who has helped us play all the games that we have played for this study. There's an enormous amount of labor that goes into that, and also helped us analyze them from different cultural perspectives. So, a little bit about how the project all got started. So, in 2015, we were playing a game in the lab called Lewis and Clark, the Expedition, and I noticed that the Native Americans in the game were treated basically like any other expendable resource in the game, so it was kind of natural to store them together with the buffalo skins and the wood and all the other kinds of resources that you needed in order to build up your expedition. So in the game, everybody is kind of a clone of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and you're trying to make it to Fort Clatsop as quickly as possible. So you build up your expedition, maybe you get some more canoes, some more resources, and in order to do that you have to expend Indians, as they're called in the rule book, and the way you get the Indians is you go to a powwow with some glass beads, and then you get more Indians. So it's a worker placement game. I thought that was connected to kind of a colonialist mindset. It's a European designer, and I thought that there was something in here that needed to be interrogated further. So I started writing a blog post about it, but in the process of doing that, I found like 5 other games, very popular at the time, board games that were sort of struggling with the same issues. So at some point I decided this needs to be a paper instead. So I took a little more time to write the paper, and while I was doing that, I just kept finding more and more games. So I went to a conference and presented my findings so far, and Mary Flanagan happened to be one of the keynote speakers at the same conference, and she was also talking about colonialism in board games, but from the colonial era. So she had been traveling mostly in Europe and the US, visiting museums and colleges and other libraries, other places where they keep these games from the actual colonial era and studied them. So she was saying that we should write a book about this. I wasn't too interested in writing a book, but she managed to convince me. She was like, oh, it will be one of those thin ones that they put out on MIT Press. And before we were done, it was a full-blown book, and I was still struggling with how much I didn't manage to include in the book. So I'm still kind of doing more work on this topic, even if the book came out last year. So that's a little bit what I'll be talking about today. Yeah, there are a lot of these games. Today, to date, I have collected about 1,500 games. And when I say that a game is colonialist rather than just colonial, I mean that it actively deals with some aspect of Western or European colonialism, somewhat related to the 4Xs of the 4X genre of board games and video games, which would be explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. But also some games that deal with othering and those kinds of aspects are in there as well. And to show that it's not just something that was going on in the past that we have sort of managed to surpass, I just wanted to show that there are more games every year coming out that are subject to these issues. So what this graph shows is that in the Board Game Geek database, on the left axis and the filled-in line, we can see that every year there are more and more board games coming out. But the dotted line on the right axis shows games in my collection that are of this kind, and we can see that those are also growing. So from around 2004, 2008, there were about 20 of them new games with these issues coming out every year, and now we're up to, or this is, the graph is from the book, so it's a couple of years old, but we're up to more like 60 of them every year. So I think we need to talk about this. And I also wanted to position myself in relation to this theme. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my childhood. This might be recognizable to a lot of people here. So I grew up in northern Sweden in the 70s and 80s, and whitewashed colonial narratives and racist stereotypes of the other were everywhere. It was in the comic books I read, in the toys I played with, the history books in school, the games I played, and even in the candy I ate. So the colonialist mindset dominated my cultural environment so much that I never even questioned this narrative. I was so immersed in it. And in this regard, I think I share a lot of similarities with many of the designers of these games. So they tend to be white Western men of roughly my age. So games that are coming out now are usually made by someone a little bit younger. But this sort of pre-pandemic couple of decades of the 21st century were definitely dominated by people that look a lot like me. So that's what the book is about. What I want to talk about here today is more specifically settler colonialism in Anglo-America. So when it comes to post-colonial studies, it's useful to divide the New World or the Americas into Anglo and Latin America rather than North and South America. And I'll get back to a little bit of why that is towards the end of the talk. But I also wanted to say that what this study focuses on is games that use maps as the boards, and how we enact those maps as players. So when I mention map board games, maybe the first thing we think of is games like Risk, or more broadly the genre of games that we sometimes refer to as dudes on a map games, even if in this early Parker Brothers version of Risk there are no dudes, no actual figurines, but they are more abstracted cubes on the map. There are many kind of map games. They can be abstract games, economical games, historical games, and educational games. And of course, a broad variety of Euro-style optimization games. When it comes to post-colonial studies, it was 30 years ago that Edward Said said this about the importance of maps and geography in post-colonial inquiry. Just as none of us is outside or beyond geography, none of us is completely free from the struggles over geography. That struggle is complex and interesting because it is not only about soldiers and cannons, but also about ideas, about forms, about images, and about imaginings. So the subject of maps have been thoroughly explored within post-colonial studies, but these studies don't cover how maps are enacted in games specifically. So that's what I want to talk about, since that's a core aspect of what makes games different from other cultural artifacts. When it comes to method, our approach is rooted in critical theory and also builds on interaction criticism. And by building a substantial collection of colonialist-themed board games and dedicating time to play through and analyze them. So for the book, we played about 400 games, I would say. And for this particular study, we have played around 200 games. We have found emergent patterns that remain hidden as long as the games are studied separately or just compared a couple of them to each other. But it should be noted that our collection is, of course, far from exhaustive. There are more games about Anglo-American settler colonialism than we could possibly acquire, and much less find time to play. And since we are limited in our language skills, sorry, I touched the mic. We also mostly played games that are in English or German, since those are the language that I understand. Okay, so the way I want to present our findings is in the form of what we call a critical lexicon. So we're trying to find uniting themes beyond or between games in this big empirical material collection, and unify them into a couple of important thematic subjects. So I'm going to start with geoglyphs, which will be a little bit of the bag that I will put the other terms into later. So a geoglyph is a large design produced on the ground that only can be perceived properly from the sky. So this particular geoglyph is known as the Uffington White Horse, and dates back from somewhere between 1400 and 500 before Common Era. So this concept lays the foundation for the rest of the analysis. When making maps playable, game creators let go of basic principles of coherence. When we reach into the past to play with it, maps cease to map onto anything. Instead, they serve a function akin to geoglyphs. They only make sense when viewed from a distance. Whenever we try to inspect that which is supposedly being mapped, as here in Carcassonne Gold Rush, where there are some geographical signifiers like cities like Nashville, for instance, they don't really make sense because we are building the map based on tactical and strategic consideration. And this opens up a space for representing imaginations of the past, which allows the game makers to focus on messaging rather than accuracy. So basically, when we are playing with maps, we are playing with the past. So our first term to put in this bag is the concept of east to west. So in accordance with the manifest destiny dogma, we often fill the geoglyphs from east to west. So manifest destiny, I wasn't too familiar with before my move to the US, but that is basically the idea that all Americans are on a God-given journey to fulfill a prophecy of taking taking hold of the new land. So whatever the struggles are, we have to move west and claim the land. The determinism of this ideology is occasionally underscored by the mechanics of the games, like in New World, where players risk losing scoring opportunities as the surveyor meeples move from east to west as you play, or in the game Go West, where players are businessmen selling supplies to the pioneers as they pass by. The next concept is paths. So in games depicting the early stages of colonialization, the westward movement follows crooked paths determined by the existing geography. Players typically race to be the first to reach locations of historical significance for the colonizers, such as Fort Clatsop or Oregon City. In the many, many Lewis and Clark and Oregon Trail games we've played, the conflict archetype employed is always man versus nature. But I think it's interesting to note that the Native Americans are always included in the nature part. They are an obstacle to overcome, they're a risk factor to deal with in your calculations, and they are part of that which has to be conquered rather than the conquerors. The next step after movement along the path is to claim land and resources. The mechanics include area enclosure and racing to tiles, and these games let players enact the map as if it was an advent calendar, so very appropriate to talk about right now, revealing prizes to the speediest claimant. In terms of messaging, these mechanics replicate the lie that Westerners earned the right to this land simply by claiming it. But they also continue the narrative of man versus nature. So once the geography has been parceled up, it can be claimed, it can be owned, and it can be sold. Next, we have the concept of lines. So as the Settler-Colonialist project nears completion, lines assert themselves over the geography-dependent paths. Train games celebrate the expansion of the American rail network in general and the completion of the connection of the two coasts with the Golden Spike, which happened in 1869, that served as the coronation of the United States as the world's leading empire. In this regard, they also celebrate the most pivotal of European colonialist dreams, Columbus's quest for a western passage to India. Nature has been conquered, and the United States has gained a dominant advantage over Great Britain by connecting the West Coast to East Asia. Once the coasts are connected, the map turns into optimization problems. The previous east to west expansion is replaced with west to east delivery of the spoils of exploitation. So while train games like 1830, Railways, and Robber Barons focus on the illicit exploitation of government funding by the so-called robber barons, the optimization games that take place after the railroad network was completed instead focus on exploitation of resources and workers in order to stay ahead of the pack. But the message is the same: expand or perish. History won't remember those who play by the rules, only those who win. And I think this is a good time to think a little bit about the labor involved in doing these different actions onto the geography. So unlike games like Puerto Rico, for instance, or Navegador, or Endeavor, or Archipelago, where slave labor is directly included or only lightly masked, there is almost no slavery on display in the Anglo-American games. The exception being the Lewis and Clark games, where famous slaves like William Clark's servant, York, or Sacagawea, who was held captive and forced to marry a French fur trapper in the Lewis and Clark expedition when she was 13, are included but never really talked about as slaves. So this is where Latin America and Anglo-America comes into play, because if we're in Latin America, we make games where slave labor can be on display, but if we're in Anglo-America, we hide it or don't talk about it. There are no southern plantation games where you do worker placement or something like that. This is seen as not okay, but we can make the exact same game in Puerto Rico, for instance. Still part of the United States, but they speak Spanish, so they're not us. We also know the role slave labor played in building all these railroads, but there are no worker placement train games. Well, that's not quite true, but the workers in worker placement train games never are the ones who lay the rails, because that's where the subject matter gets a little toxic. So when we play with workers, it's either as homesteaders who are earning the rights to the land with their own sweat, or where land was taken from Native Americans and given to them by the government, or white laborers that made the Carnegies, Vanderbilts, and Rockefellers richer than almost imaginable. I think there's a direct through line in what we do in these games and modern captains of industry like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, but there are, again, no games about working or directing workers for Amazon or something like that, because if we put it in current time, it again becomes a little too critical. But when we do that with Carnegie, it's all in the past, and we don't really care too much about those workers. Okay, that's the aside about labor. My final term for the critical lexicon is the palimpsest, so the phenomenon of using a canvas or a paper for that has been previously used for a painting and painting it over with a new image. Finally, these games almost always imply an empty void before the trails, homesteads, rails, and borders fill the map. This not only enforces the terra nullius myth, the idea that there was empty land somewhere for the Westerners to colonize, but we also argue that the less we see of the pre-Columbian geography, the easier it is to not think of the land as being occupied. The geoglyphs become markings of ownership and a process of slowly dissolving the underlying palimpsest. We argue that the construction and enactment of game maps by makers and players reinforces the messaging of a hegemonic occupier. In the vernacular of James C. Scott, we are invited to see like a state, but we also act from the perspective of an imperial force. Maps that can be easily interpreted, transferred, and copied inherently expresses a vantage point of power. Maps used in the area before the Western settler-colonialist enterprise would typically be embedded in oral traditions of knowledge transfer so that an overpowering outside force couldn't find relevant resources to exploit and enemies to kill. Geoglyphs, like the Uffington white horse, survive with a regular ritual maintenance by the communities they are made within, often with their original meaning and context lost. Like the horse, which from the start would have required regular upkeep to stay visible, the mythology and values of settler colonialism are maintained through the regular ritual enactment of the stories in these games. So as we fill the auspiciously empty map board with paths, zones, and lines, we continually marginalize and erase the peoples who first lived in these lands until they are made invisible at the edge. So I found a dissertation from Sweden from 2014 about industrial colonialism in northern Sweden, so installing hydropower plants in reindeer pasture areas. And it opens with a poem written in Sami language, but in its Swedish translation it's called Osynliga vid randen, which becomes invisible at the edge in English. So in the poem, the line refers to the Sami people disappearing as the geography is restructured by changing the flow of rivers. So I will close by inviting you to think about what the parallels are between the settler colonial narratives of these games set in Anglo-America and our own play practices and cultural practices of what we are doing here and now. Thank you.
All right, we have a catch box for anyone with questions. No? Am I throwing it? No.
Thank you, Mikael. It was really interesting, and you obviously have huge amounts of material, so this entices us all to get our hands on the book and learn more. This kind of cultural scripts, they are tricky things because they are, of course, encapsulating certain kind of ideologies, and you have showed that there are indeed various forms and quite a lot of nuance and richness in interpreting these. They are also part of this kind of vernacular that makes certain kind of accessibility to games, for example, possible. So it was interesting to see the amount of games in general, but also games encapsulating these kind of elements steadily growing even today. So do you think that it might be one explanation of their popularity, that they are part of this kind of popular culture and popular history that is accessible and makes the threshold for entering the game world a bit lower?
Right. So I definitely think that there are a number of reasons for this. So I think of board games as the epitome of sort of family friendliness. It's something that we put at the center of the table when we get the family together for Christmas or some vacation or some other sort of celebration of not having to work. And I think that that puts certain requirements on the cultural artifacts. And one of them is to be not turning anyone away. And I think that it's so paradoxical that from a designer who is immersed enough in European or Western colonial mindset, what makes a game inclusive is to put it in an era that is far away from here and now, and also make sure that at least all the white people are heroes in the game and become really rich and famous. And it's mostly about who gets the richest and the most famous. But everybody in these games are having success in their lives. So to me, it's really about a blindness to what these games or what the history is really about that we are playing. So as I said, one might think that it shouldn't be problematic to make a game about an Amazon warehouse, but they would never do it because it feels like someone's going to be upset. Someone's going to start talking about how they don't get to go on bathroom breaks or something. But when we play a rail game or some other game that involves a lot of slave labor, we don't even expect people to have to worry about it. But what happens is, of course, that some people aren't even being invited to the table. So I was playing the game Puerto Rico, which is about being the most efficient slave owner in Puerto Rico during the Spanish colonial rule there. And I was playing it with a graduate student from our program who is from Puerto Rico. She has a background in political science and has ancestry from the Taino people that were almost extinguished by the Spanish. And I was asking her if she would play the game again after we had played it, because it's a little bit special when we play it in the lab. We are all sort of with our critical hats on and talking about and pulling out these narratives. And she said, yeah, I'd bring that home and play it with my family. It's such a ridiculous telling of history. It's so wrong in so many ways that I can't even take it serious. Like, we're exporting corn. Puerto Rico has never exported corn, and I had to look it up in the old ledgers, and it's true. They were importing corn from North America at the time, but yeah, the game designer is clear needed kind of a starting crop that you can use to sort of work your way up to tobacco and sugar and the more sort of profitable crops to make it make sense from a game engine perspective. So, but she thought it was a little long or she thought her mom was going to think it was a little too long, and I would agree. But then I asked if she came to, because she's a big board gamer, if she came to a board game group, like a meetup group in Boston, and all the people there were white people, and they were playing Puerto Rico, would you stay? And she was, no, that would be, I would not feel invited there. So there is this invisible wall that we're building around who is invited to the table when we are playing games with these subject matters. So yeah, I think we need to think through more what these games are about, rather than just diffusing it with it's just a game, it doesn't matter, let's just have fun, those kinds of attitudes.
Hi, there's one question in the chat from online from Mauricio Castro Valdez. So, hello, nice talk. In your research, have you been able to trace whether this type of discourse and its mechanics are circulated in board game design training programs?
Right. So we make a pretty strong argument, strong in terms of it's not necessarily being agreed upon by the research community in general in the book, that it's not just the thematic content of these board games that is colonialist, it's also the mechanics in and of themselves. So there is a popular belief that board game mechanics, they just are what they are. We have found the most pleasurable way of building from a beginning of a game state to an end state, whether it's worker placement or some kind of network building or deck building, what have you. But we believe that since all of these mechanics have emerged inside of the Western colonial endeavor, they are strongly connected. So there are actually missing mechanics that we aren't being taught in these programs or aren't seeing in good examples. As you know, in design studies, we put a lot of emphasis on getting inspiration from good examples. So it's hard to deviate from this path if we don't have those examples to work out of, or we don't have an idea of what that part of the design space looks like. So I don't think it's necessarily that we are promoting certain types of games because we think, like that's okay that colonialism is such an integral part. We are promoting them because that's what's out there. But I do think that there are missing masses out there that we have to explore and articulate in order to improve our design educations as well, to be more inclusive.
I have the box now, so I'll ask another question just out of curiosity. Personally, when cataloging kind of games that have the colonialist themes, do you also include like seemingly anti-colonialist games like Spirit Island, that sort of games?
Yes, that is of course my favorite genre when it comes. So I have to say again, we've had research assistants coming to the media studies program at MIT for their graduate studies and being really hyped about being research assistants and teaching assistants in the game lab because they love Mario and Zelda or whatever the kids are into these days. And then they spend 2 years playing old colonialist board games. And it takes a toll on them mentally. But every now and then we get to play a game, like Spirit Island, for instance, and they love it, and we all loved it. And I think it's maybe because it's that contrast, but it's also a very, very fun game, I think. But we do look at those as well, and especially since I got done with the book, I have gotten really interested in games against oppression, not just colonialism, but oppression in general. And in the board game space, there is a lot happening there right now. We cover some of it in the last chapter of the book, but I already feel that chapter is a little bit outdated now because there's so much interesting stuff happening in that area.
When you compare these kinds of colonial games that deal with certain topics like trains or expansion of those things, compared to games that also deal with those same topics, but not in such an obviously colonial way, like Ticket to Ride, for example, being based in Europe, expansion that way, are there differences in the core mechanics that you see, or would you even say there is a difference in these kinds of things, or is these themes always kind of prescient and permeating out mechanically?
Right. So I think with the Ticket to Ride, it's actually a good example. So Alan Moon, the designer, had made a number of train games before he arrived at Ticket to Ride. So he started out being a fan of the 18xx genre of games, like the 1830 game here, for instance, which is set in Anglo-America, which is where he lived as well at the time. But he couldn't get that published. He started his own publishing company and made some train games that took down the complexity of the 18xx genre of games. Can't go in too much into it, but those are very heavy, complex economical games where you're running a company. And part of that is building out train lines and buying train engines and all of that. But so he took it down a little bit. He made a game called Union Pacific, for instance, where you still have the concept of shares. So even if someone owns a company, there are other players can be shareholders in your company, and they can buy you out. You can dump the company on someone else after having robbed it of all its resources. All those things that the traditional robber barons did to each other, and that still wasn't a big success, but it at least got published because it was a little less complex than the 18xx games. And eventually he had stripped the 18xx concept down to just basically network building. and that's where it took flight in Europe first, but really all over the world. So the genealogy of it is very clear. It has a colonial theory underlying it, even if it's set in, by now we have Ticket to Ride Everything because they make a new one every year, so you can build railroad anywhere, but it was really based on Western ideology and American ideology of Manifest Destiny clearly. So if he had some other kind of proto game that he had been inspired by and then distilled down to something, it would probably have looked very different and been maybe less about expansion and exploitation.
Thank you. Do you think that board games like these that you mentioned in your talk that like really replicate the historical settings, is there a reason that they replicate the historical settings instead of aiming for more fictional settings? Because if thinking about video games like Minecraft or Factorio or RimWorld that replicate similar mechanics of settler-colonialism, but they do it without the historical framing, is there like a very, other than just like aiming for familiarity with the setting, that why the games like aim for such deliberately historical framings?
Yes. So in that regard, the origins of the board game industry, if we can call it that, is very different than the video game industry. So it really started taking shape in Germany first. That's where we had a critical mass of board game designers who were learning from each other and competing with each other to try to make better and better games. And they started to have competitions, and they saw that if you win this, especially one of the competitions called Spiel des Jahres, you can actually sell a lot of games. They announced the winner in fall, and then a lot of families buy that game for Christmas. So in that model, they saw that we need to make games that are simple enough that the children can learn them and understand them and play them and have fun, but it's going to be the parents and maybe especially the father who decides what to spend money on for a Christmas gift. So if we can appeal to daddy as well, then we will have a winning formula. And I think dads are into history, I don't know, for some reason. So I think that's why we in the Euro games especially have all this. And it's not really about that history. As I said, if you start looking at it in detail, it makes absolutely no sense. So you just kind of have to see it at a distance or at a glance to buy that this is about building railroads or whatever it is. And in that regard, I think that's a particularity of how the board game industry has evolved.
Thank you. A little bit in the line of the comment on seemingly anti-colonial games like Spirit Island, and also the idea of like fictional scenarios. I was thinking of a somewhat recent game called Sand by Deville. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
No.
I think it's interesting because it takes place in this fictional setting where there's been a huge drought and sort of an ecological catastrophe, and the players take the role of people who are trying to take seeds and flowers to repopulate this. So there's this logic of, hey, let's be like eco-critical and rebuild and reconstruct. but there's also this sense of dominance, control, export, basically like manage your resources to carry the most efficient way, like to maximize where do you take the seeds, where do they want them the most, how are you going to get the most benefit. And I feel like it sort of stands in this weird in-between spot where some of the mechanical logics are still part of this sort of exploit and maximize, but the fictional narrative of it is trying to do something different. I wanted to know how you feel about that tension.
Yeah. I have a lot of feelings. So I compare this to when we talk about the art space in general, or art games in particular. We sometimes talk about the avant-garde, who tries to do something completely new and questioning everything, including mechanics. And then we have more of the critical games, which takes the formulas that we already know and then subvert the use of the formula. So in this regard, I would probably put it more towards a critical game, not necessarily saying that it's an art game. It can be a commercial game still, but using the knowledge we have about how to build enticing systems using certain mechanics, but presenting a counter image to it. And in that regard, I think Spirit Island does something that's again a little bit in that in-between space. And I think that's perfectly fine. But I do think that we also need the avant-garde. We need the question everything to find these sort of non-cataloged mechanics that I was talking about previously. But I'm definitely excited to check out that game.
Thank you for a super interesting talk, and I was really happy to see James C. Scott and seeing like a state mentioned, because I feel that that's something that there's a lot of thinking there that is useful in games. But my question is about sort of the process of playing these games. And since you played so many of these games, I'm wondering what it's like to be at the table. How do you play them? Do you like play them as European colonialist? Do you play them sort of from a critical point of view? Do you play them like you're the dad and you're the 14-year-old? Sort of is there like role play going on when you are engaging with these games?
Yeah, it's kind of a complex space because we play these games sometimes with visiting artists or designers that come from, if we have someone from India, we play games that are supposed to be about India with them. If they come from China, we play China games with them to get the perspective of like what sort of try to disentangle the mythology that is being created about India, because it's always in these games, spoiler, seen from a Western perspective, right? So in those situations, I think we're sort of tearing the games apart as we play them, which if we always did that, would I think miss something, because it's because the play experience is so pleasurable and so inviting and engaging that the sort of messaging is so insidious, I think. So in other situations, we do really try to recreate, let's play the game just for fun, and then do the analysis once we're done, sort of put two sections in the process. But we also exist within a space with certain norms. So we of course have safe space norms for the lab. So especially when we play with students, we don't want the students to ever feel forced to do something that makes them feel bad on a level that they aren't sure they can handle it. So in that regard, we need to do a little bit of sort of emotional hand-holding as well. We need to sometimes break and talk about how we feel about employing these little black boys as we go down the river of Congo or something like that, and play them at the right moment to avoid being attacked ourselves, or whatever it is. There's just sometimes horrible things going on, and one could say that it taints the methodology, that we're not having the real experience all the time. But I don't think we should. I don't think we can. But we try to also enjoy gaming even when we know that the game is problematic. But I have to say, I'm kind of done, especially with Euro games, because when you play so many of them in a row, you start feeling like they're all kind of very similar. But it's the same as when I was in Sweden. I was reviewing video games for 10 years. I was playing over 50 games a year. And it was the same thing with like single player, first person and third person shooters. At some point, I stopped remembering which thing happened in which game or which gun was from which game. There's just, it sort of becomes this mass. So there's that.
Thanks very much. It's really interesting. My questions are maybe a bit dumb, and I'm sorry about that, but they're kind of about some of the definitions that you use. I'm not very familiar with board games, but I was seeing a lot of games there that I wouldn't consider board games because they just involve putting pieces that are like smaller boards together. Especially there was one like Carcassonne style games. Right. So you're including those kind of games in the category of board games?
Right, yes. So I would say historically in sort of taxonomical efforts within board games, there's either board games and card games, and we separate those into two categories, or we put everything in the same box as long as you're roughly sitting around the table as you're playing. So it's a very broad category. Even in the more narrow taxonomical approaches, there is no separation between something like Carcassonne and Ticket to Ride, which in a sense make a lot of sense to me, because you go to the same place to buy them, they come in the same kind of shaped box, and you configure the players in a very similar manner. They share a history where the designer of a board game like Ticket to Ride, as I mentioned, started out by making 18xx games, which are built around tiles. So, and it goes the other way around as well, where Klaus-Jürgen Wrede, who made Carcassonne, has made a lot of board games with actual boards in them as well. So it's the same
thing that you could say about that. Like, what would be the advantage of using a different scale, or do you imagine what other things you might find, or something like that?
Right. So in the book, we do the whole world, but the whole planet, I should say. So I think at some point I also want to go into space exploration and see how that sort of retreads the path of Western colonialism. But more importantly, I think there's so many games that I am not even aware of the existence of. Oh, I touched the mic again. Because they are made in a language that I don't understand, exist within a culture that I have no connection to, etc., etc. So that's the kind of research that I'm the most excited to hear about within this field. And in that regard, we really regard a book as just kind of a tent pole and make a call to others to help raising the tent, because there's a lot of stuff that we can't deal with from the particular vantage points we have as Westerners, and we simply can't have, I think. So it's by no means comprehensive, but we kind of did what we could do, and then we hope for help from others in the community. Research is a co-op game, as you know.
Yeah, so you kind of talk about this insidious engagement and joy in these systems and mechanics, right, that are very clearly referential to real colonial practices by real people and then essentialized down. How connected do you think this kind of insidious, horrific joy is to the real experience of being a colonialist, and a kind of insidious, horrific joy they either really had, or was this like an entire fabrication for political propagandic purposes?
Right. Again, this is a very complex issue again, but we talk a little bit about the different kinds of joys that you have when you're playing these games, and I do think that they, in some sense, also map to different kinds of joys of colonialism. So to some people, Said says, for instance, that to some people colonialism was a career. Especially in the UK, you could, as a young man, go to India, and if you made it home alive, you were rich. You could buy a rotten borough and join the House of Lords or whatever, which is, by the way, represented very well in a board game called John Company. So it's a satire of playing as the British East India Company employees. But it's very, very strongly historically connected. But it can also be, and I think in that regard, yeah, there is some kind of joy to it, as long as you disregard the ugly side of it, as if you are a young British gentleman who goes to India. You're not killing anyone. You're living in your little mansion and you dictate orders, but all the killing is done by other people from India who are killing each other, and you don't really have to deal with it. So there is a certain joy to it, but there's also a joy. So there's games about playing as people who organize all the goods that come into harbors in Amsterdam, for instance. So you make sure you can fit all the different spices and sugar and whatever is coming from the Dutch East India Company. And just that kind of little organization puzzle is fun to do in the game, but probably also something that was fun to do in real life, especially since you were seeing all the profits that you were making from having the ships come in and bargain for buying their goods and then selling their goods for many times the value. So I do think that the mapping often works, but of course board games in general are fictions where we much more often get to be the heroes and the most successful ones rather than someone who was also ran. So of course it's embellished and it's reinforced, but yeah, we're still dealing with playing people who were made rich and famous and respected, and we still have statues of them.
Thank you very much. Okie dokie. We have another talk tomorrow at 4:30. We're